And so I do believe that it's a more Russia war than Putin war. And no matter who realistically comes to power after Putin, the war probably will continue, maybe with a different intensity, maybe with a different outcome. Maybe it will be lost even by that. But the fact that they will want to continue the war, I have no doubt about that.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Jonathan Saman Hot Buttons Cool Conversations discussion series. I'm Lily Rabinoff-Goldman, President and CEO of JCC Greater Boston. We're thrilled you are all joining us tonight for our speaker series, Hot Buttons Cool Conversations. This series invites distinguished public figures to engage in conversation on thought-provoking and stimulating subjects. Our panelists are led by expert moderators through respectful and timely discussions on issues of concern to the Jewish community and beyond. We're honored to bring you tonight's program, The War on Ukraine, Can Putin Be Stopped? Russia's 15-month-long war so far on Ukraine continues to rage as Ukraine prepares to mount a long-anticipated counteroffensive. But Putin is convinced he can outlast both Ukraine and the West, preparing for a grueling war that could last for years. Tonight we ask, can Putin be stopped? We will look at the devastating effects of the war on the Ukrainian people, where global alliances fall, and the U.S. role in the war. We are so honored to have an incredibly distinguished panel joining us tonight. Carol Savitz is the Senior Advisor in the MIT Security Studies Program. She is co-chair of the MIT seminar series, Focus on Russia, and the author and contributing editor of 5 books and numerous articles on Russian foreign policy. Welcome, Carol. We're so happy you're here tonight. Ole Katsuba is the manager of publications at the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University. His research focuses on 20th century and contemporary Russian and Ukrainian literature and culture. Ole, thank you for being here. We're so happy to have you.
Thank you.
And finally, moderating our conversation this evening is Alexandra Vakru, Executive Director of the Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies at Harvard. Her work addresses Russian and Eurasian policy issues, including the war in Ukraine. Thank you so much, Alexandra, for being here tonight.
Thanks, Lily.
Now let's turn things over to our moderator. Alexandra?
Thanks so much, Lily. So I've been asked to set the scene for this conversation and kind of bring us up to date on what's happening with the war. Russia's full-scale invasion started in February 2022, but for Ukraine, it really began in 2014 when Russia annexed Crimea and also supported separatists that were operating in Donbass, eastern Ukraine. In the 8 years since Russia first invaded, much changed within Ukraine, not least of all the country's population sensed that they were really Ukrainian and they were unified against Russia. Russia didn't notice this was happening and grossly miscalculated, assuming it could march into Kiev within 3 days and have a parade. That, of course, did not happen. So here we are a year later. Ukrainians have endured barrage after barrage of rocket strikes, cruise missiles, war crimes, and other atrocities, but still they continue to fight. And the Russians continue to throw people and materiel at the problem without making significant advances. How long can this last? How bad can it get? And what can we do to support Ukraine and to punish Russia? Why should it matter to you? Today, we're going to talk about these questions and much more. And I want to start with Ole, who is himself Ukrainian, and ask him, what are the 3 most important things that our audience needs to understand about Ukraine to make sense of this war?
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. And thank you to JCC Greater Boston and to WGBH for organizing this conversation. I think there are several important things about this war, but perhaps it's worth dividing it by different participating or non-participating sides. So what is the most important thing for Ukraine or for Ukrainians? I believe that it emerges out of the struggle as well as the discourse right now in Ukraine, that the most important thing are human lives. For Ukraine, it's all about saving human lives. And we have seen that when towns have been liberated in Ukraine, that uncovered horrible atrocities committed against civilian population there, where people were executed or tortured or put through filtration camps, much like what we've seen back in the 20th century. And so for Ukrainians, it's really not about the territory. The war is about people, about human lives. Now, what is the war for Russia? There are many answers to that, I think, because Russia as such, of course, is not homogenous, and its political elite is also not just Putin. But I think that what really matters in this war to Russia is to break Ukrainians, is to annihilate Ukrainian identity from the face of earth, because it presents a certain challenge that they don't know and were not able to deal with up until now. And so it could be seen culturally, it could be seen politically as a challenge that appears to be dangerous to the current Russian regime. And finally, what is the war for the rest of the world? And I don't believe that we can just divide it into the West and East, but I think more into democracies and autocratic regimes. And so for the democratic part of the international community, this war is really about proving that democracy is a viable form of self-government, and that democracy can effectively withstand such extreme challenges as this war. For other autocratic regimes, it's really also about survival of their own regimes once again. And finally, I think that for many countries and many different politicians, this war is also about an inconvenience. They would like to go back to business as usual as soon as possible, to continue making money, to continue making deals with Russia. And because they cannot, countries such as Hungary, for example, are having a very ambivalent attitude towards the war.
So let's pick up on that question of the changes in geopolitical relationships. And I want to ask Carol, we got used to a certain balance of power or geopolitical situation after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed. How has the war changed that?
The war has really brought a number of fundamental changes, I think. I think what we're seeing, first of all, is a much more unified West, something that Putin didn't count on. Even Zelensky's trip to Europe in the last couple of days, where he's garnered a lot more equipment, promises military deliveries and everything, really signals that something that Ola referred to, that there's a concern about framing this as if it were a fight of democracy against autocracy. It's not just the land grab on the part of the Russians, but it has many more fundamental values in that. I think we've also seen, we got kind of used to use your term, Alexandra, we got kind of used to Russia and the U.S. not always getting along, but certainly not being at loggerheads. We had the START treaties, we had the joint space exploration and things like that. And what we're seeing as a result of the war, although it began before as a major attenuation of ties, Russia just suspended its participation in New START. And Putin has tried to frame it as not only a war against Ukraine, but a war against NATO, a war against the West. I also think that what we're seeing is a sort of reordering of the major structure of the world. I mean, we were going to pivot to Asia. Russia kept talking about a pivot to Asia. China is playing a major role here, but it almost looks as if it's the West or the democracies against China, Russia, maybe Iran. So we've seen different poles develop as compared to what we saw during the Cold War. And if I can add one more, I also think that we will see, as a result of this, sort of a reordering of relations among the post-Soviet states and between Russia and its former republics or former Soviet republics, as they try to figure out what the war means for them. Do they have more leeway to try to separate themselves more from Russia? Some are playing very interesting and sometimes duplicitous games, but it's been interesting to watch how they have reacted and how they're using other states as well to protect themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a lot to follow up on there, but let me go back to this question which both of you raised, which is seeing this conflict as a question of democracies against authoritarian regimes. And one of the questions I have for Ole is about Ukraine's democratic development. We heard today that the head of the Supreme Court has been arrested for corruption. And I heard that there are, different interpretations. On the one hand, you think, oh my gosh, there's still so much corruption. On the other hand, you think like it's an amazing sign that they're willing to arrest very high-powered officials who are still corrupt. Could you give us a sense of where Ukraine is in terms of its development as a viable, strong democracy?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's probably a very good example. But first of all, we need to remember that Ukraine is still very young as a democracy, right? It's not even 30 years old, right? And many of the institutions that have been active in Ukraine were inherited from the Soviet Union. And so overcoming that heritage, which was incredibly corrupt, as we know, right? There was a lot of kind of this, deals that are made behind the scenes when you have some formal framework, but it really didn't matter. And so in Ukraine, cultural elites, political elites, but also activists over the past few decades have been dismantling those systems. And so a lot of progress has been made because Ukrainians managed to establish several anti-corruption organizations and, of course, kind of staffing them, setting them up, creating those checks and balances around them has been very difficult, which makes sense, I think, in any political system. And so I think that the change here with Zelensky has been, and his record is also not entirely, all white and beautiful, but what he has changed is that he has been cracking down on even on close allies in terms of eliminating corrupt behavior. And so I think that this case that has been prosecuted by the National Anti-Corruption Bureau in Ukraine shows that, the political elite means it. This is the highest position on the kind of the Supreme Court of Ukraine that decides kind of in the last instance, many cases that go through the court system in Ukraine. And so cleaning it up, and there are potential other consequences out of that particular arrest and accusation of that judge, because potentially other judges were involved as well in similar schemes. So that already shows that the government is working very hard to reestablish trust into the judicial branch of the government. So in that sense, I think it's a very important sign, and Ukraine indeed has made a lot of progress. I think what is wrong sometimes is that in the West, a lot of discourse is about making Ukraine into a poster child of corruption. Ukraine is in many ways no more or no less corrupt than many other countries in the world, to the east of Ukraine or to the west of Ukraine. And here too, we have seen a lot of kind of push and pull, right, in terms of various corrupt or at least unethical behavior in various spheres, both in economics, but also in politics and elsewhere. And so this is kind of the conflict of interest is, I think, a universally human experience, and separating the formal from informal behavior and kind of getting gain in a way that you shouldn't get it is something that is universal to human nature, I think, to kind of the relationships that emerge. So we try to clean it up, as well as many others, who deal with that experience. And so I think it's important to see that as it develops, from the early 90s and until today. And so the progress is tremendous.
Ole is talking about one of the Soviet legacies, one of the unpleasant Soviet legacies. But Carol, you had alluded to another one, which is the relationship between Russia and its neighbors, who were once part of the single Soviet Union. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about what's happening in the 5 Central Asian countries or in the 3 countries of the Caucasus. How has the war led them to reevaluate the way that they understand their relationship and dependence to some extent on Moscow?
I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of frustration that Russia has sort of sidelined itself in terms of the local politics, in terms of the regional politics, both in Central Asia and in the Caucasus, when, as a follow-on to the war between Armenia and Azerbaijan in 2020, there have been skirmishes all fall and ongoing, and the Armenians have basically said, so where are you, Russia? You're supposed to be our protector, where Russia is obviously involved in Ukraine and not able or willing to divert its attention to help the Armenians. And we saw the same thing when skirmishes broke out between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. The Kyrgyz said the same thing. So why do we belong to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is basically Russia and a few allies? Why aren't you helping us? Why aren't you sending in troops? Why aren't you sending us arms, etc.? And again, it's kind of like, well, we'll send you a policeman, but we're not going to do much, literally one policeman, and we're not going to do much more than that. And so I think that it's sort of forcing the other states to reevaluate their positions. I think one of the most interesting cases is Kazakhstan, where on the one hand, the president has been very vocal about criticizing the war, has said that Kazakhstan is never going to recognize the provinces that Russia has recently annexed, at the same time as they have allowed Russia basically to bust the sanctions by allowing the transshipment of all kinds of Western equipment, computer chips, etc., into China. And the Kazakhs may be targeted by the United States and the Europeans for violating sanctions. So we'll have to see how this plays out. But you sort of see them trying to situate themselves, and at least rhetorically, to announce their independence or greater independence from Russia and from that whole post-Soviet space, as we used to call it.
Mm-hmm. And what, Ole, is Ukraine's attitude, both towards its former Soviet, let's say, neighboring republics, and also towards the allies that are further out? I mean, it seems like the focus has definitely been on the allies and on garnering support, but I'm sure that the foreign policy is more nuanced than that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, absolutely. There are several problems in relations with the former Soviet republics. And I think precisely for the reasons that Carol described, because they are, those former Soviet republics, they're weak militarily or politically, or dependent on Russia. And so really, one example that stands out is Georgia, right? A country that has applied for the association. So in fact, has the association agreement with the European Union, I believe, and has wanted to apply for membership as well, but did not get as far in that process because of the issues of a very close alignment with Russia in recent years. And kind of the most recent example being that Russia reopened or lifted the ban on direct flights from Russia to Georgia. And while the president of Georgia, who actually also was put into her position by a pro-Russian oligarch back in the day, so she protested against that, but the party, the government in power currently, in fact, supported that, and they're already planning direct flights. And so that, of course, is something that is seen as an unfriendly gesture by Ukrainians, and especially from someone who has been considered such a close ally as Georgia. There's also Moldova, on the other hand, for example, that has several problems within the country itself. Right? There's a Transnistrian Republic that is unrecognized entity supported by Russia, where Russian troops are stationed, and where Russia has threatened several times that a possible attack on Ukraine could happen. But they also have threatened an attack on Moldova. And so in contrast to the situation with Georgia, Ukraine has worked very closely with Moldova and with President Sandu, who is a very pro-European politician and seeks a closer alliance integration with the European Union. So those two examples, I think, are probably kind of on this wider range of relations with other former Soviet republics. And of course, there are countries such as Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan and others where it's a lot more difficult to work with because of those existing complications in their own relations with Russia. Of course, the most extreme example is the Republic of Belarus, under the unrecognized president Lukashenko, who basically has given his country's territory to Russia to launch the attack on Ukraine, and is supporting in various other ways the war on Ukraine, including allowing Russian jets to launch from Belarusian airfields, and launch bombs and shells on Ukraine. So that, of course, that's the most hostile, I think, of all of those republics.
Can I jump in for a sec about Belarus? I think it's really interesting. First of all, Lukashenko is apparently ill and has disappeared from the scene, which could fundamentally change some of those dynamics. I also think Lukashenko's walking a very fine line between, well, Russia saved him, so he's going to be supportive of Russia, and there are Russian troops on the ground, and there may be tactical nuclear weapons deployed there and everything. On the other hand, I think he knows that if they become more actively involved in the war, that he's going to face a crisis at home, much as he faced 2 years ago, and he's very much afraid of that. And the opposition has made it clear that there will be major repercussions if Belarus becomes even more actively involved in the war. So we have to be sort of careful as to how we categorize Belarus, I think.
Exactly, absolutely. But kind of just to be from the Ukrainian perspective, of course, Belarus is a major platform for Russia's war on Ukraine. And so a lot of kind of danger that emanates from Belarus for Ukraine, and where Ukraine has to, in fact, prepare certain defensive maneuvers, potential defensive maneuvers, and kind of draw certain troops to the Belarusian border just to make sure that nothing happens there. So, but that's what I mean is that this is perhaps the most hostile of all of the former Soviet republics. And in general, of course, Russia has tried very hard to control the former Soviet republics as much as possible, right? Various quasi-state organizations were created where Russia had the leading role, such as the Commonwealth of Independent States, for example, that basically, in recent years fell apart, especially after 2014, but also the Security Organization and so on. So a lot of these organizations were meant to, in some way, to replace the structure of the Soviet Union in Russia's attempt to control the post-Soviet republics. And so to what extent they succeeded, I think it's a big question, right? Because most republics do seek independence from Russia, but also they are dependent in other ways, on Russia, and therefore are unable to do that.
No, it's hard to escape the impression that Russia's potential to influence these countries, these former Soviet republics, has really peaked because of the self-inflicted wounds that it's incurring now based on the war and the fact that it is so distracted trying to keep things going. But the real challenge for them in the recent years has been the competition implicit with China and China's efforts to really make inroads into Central Asia in particular through the Belt and Road program or through investments. And Carol, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit both about what China's view is on this Eurasian region, and then also on what their role is in the war. Is it possible that they could be involved in some kind of end to the war, or is that a public relations stunt?
It's a great question. I'm going to do the second one first. I can't see China being trusted by the Ukrainians in terms of being an independent, neutral mediator between Russia and Ukraine. Xi Jinping has said all the right things about protecting independence and sovereignty and everything else, but it's very clear that he is siding with the Russians in terms of the war, but he is definitely trying to position himself. Now, we don't know what he's saying to Putin behind closed doors. There have been reports that he's kind of said it's enough and it's not the era for war. There have also been reports that he's told Putin that under no uncertain terms should he consider using a tactical nuclear weapon in the field, that would be a red line that China would not cross. On the other hand, we don't know what the Chinese are actually shipping or allowing to be shipped to the Russians to supplement the war effort. So if I were a Ukrainian, I would be very leery of efforts by the Chinese to offer their services as mediators. The other question that you asked about the Chinese role in Central Asia is fascinating and multifaceted. On the one hand, you do have the Belt and Road Initiative, which was announced in Almaty way back in the day and was designed to pull the Central Asian states, at least economically, into China's orbit. Until very recently, China has sort of been saying to the Russians, we understand it's your sphere of influence. We're not doing anything militarily, but we're going to make all these great economic investments, which will help all these countries. At some point, there has to be sort of a tipping point in there where, because Russia is now so weakened, as you put it, a self-inflicted wound because of the war, they've pulled troops from Russians have pulled troops from Central Asia to send them into Ukraine, etc. I could see China eventually actually working militarily with the other states in the region as well. And let's not forget that the Belt and Road Initiative goes all the way through the Caucasus, and it actually involved Ukraine at one point and goes into Europe. So it's not just that it's focused on Central Asia. The downside for the Chinese is that a number of the Central Asian states are sort of wary of the Chinese. There are too many Chinese people who are involved in the infrastructure projects, who's actually going to own the infrastructure projects through the Belt and Road Initiative. Eventually, we've now seen China needing to recalibrate the debt that these states are incurring and stuff. But China is definitely knocking at Central Asia's door. And I think depending on how the war proceeds, one could see China becoming much more sort of instrumentally involved in the politics of the region.
So one of the things you mentioned is that it looks like China is tamping down Russian propensity to potentially use tactical nuclear weapons for battlefield advantage. And I was wondering, Ole, there are two nuclear risks, if you will. One is that the Russians will use a nuclear weapon, and the second is that they're going to do some damage to the Zaporizhia nuclear plant, that it's going to melt down because it won't be able to continue cooling. And I was wondering, how are the Ukrainians looking at these two risks? It's very hard to live with, obviously, on a daily basis. What is the assessment inside the country?
Yeah, well, I mean, we do have to, I think, as a setting for this conversation about the nuclear threat, we do need to mention that kind of conventionally nuclear weapons are considered a deterrent, but Putin is using it as a blackmailing tactic, right? It's not that he is deterring other countries from attacking Russia. He is deterring other countries from helping Ukraine, basically. That's the kind of, so it's a blackmail mechanism right now, so it doesn't serve the kind of the originally, in quotation marks, intended purpose. That's number one. Number two, what needs to be mentioned is that Ukraine has made probably the largest contribution to the nuclear security in the world, having abandoned a huge nuclear arsenal following the collapse of the Soviet Union, when Ukraine inherited thousands and thousands of nuclear warheads and facilities to, ICBMs and so on. And Ukraine has basically, abandoned that nuclear arsenal in exchange for security assurances from the United States, United Kingdom, and Russia, and later China and France joined in. And so that's what is called the Budapest Memorandum. So that did not save Ukraine from, being invaded and parts of Ukraine being annexed by Russia. So all of this in the context of the current nuclear threat and the way that people see it in Ukraine results basically in, on the one hand, a very high resentment against any kind of agreements with Russia going forward. Russia is not a trusted partner in any way and cannot be trusted, whatever they say or sign. So Ukraine basically made a bad deal and now is paying for that, for being so gullible. And on the other hand, Ukrainians are absolutely resolved to win or die. And no one believes that, even a nuclear strike is going to break Ukrainians. Ukrainians have shown the entire world that they're extremely resilient. We have survived Chernobyl, and if need be, we will survive Zaporizhia nuclear disaster. And God forbid it happens, because this is the largest nuclear power plant in Europe, as we know. And so Russia, as we know, at the beginning of the war, Russia occupied the Chernobyl, nuclear power station that is out of commission, but has a lot of kind of radioactive material being stored there, and the potential for something bad happening there, was possible, even though minimal. And of course, that possibility at the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant is a lot higher because you have 6 nuclear reactors, and Russians have basically turned it into a fortified kind of installation where they store a lot of weapons. There is a lot of missiles and other kind of installations positioned there. They're preparing for the possibility that the Zaporizhzhia power plant is encircled, and then they would be basically shooting at Ukrainians from there without Ukrainians being able to shoot back, right? Because then the power plant would be damaged. So all of this taken together, of course, is very difficult to live with, but at the same time, the resolve among Ukrainians is extremely high. Almost 90%, over 90% of people, when asked, believe that Ukraine will prevail in this war, and everyone understands that the price for independence and for the right to be Ukrainians and to live on our land, it may be very steep.
So, Carol, maybe Putin is just bluffing, right? So many times now he said that he's going to use nuclear weapons. Sorry. Is it just a bluff? I mean, do you think that it's a possibility that he would use them?
Well, it's very interesting. There was an article published just the other day by somebody whom you and I both know, saying that he's convinced that Russia's not bluffing and that Russia's going to use a tactical nuclear weapon. I'm not as pessimistic as that. I think if Putin felt that his regime were really threatened by the catastrophe that is this war, he might be tempted. But I think I would argue that currently he's got to choose between continuing Chinese support on the international stage and perhaps weapons and computer chips and everything else, and the temptation to use a nuclear weapon. And I would argue that he would opt for China and the Chinese support and not for the use of a nuclear weapon. I think it would also hurt the Russian soldiers on the ground as well as Ukrainian soldiers. I mean, there would be a lot of blowback to the average Russian if he were to use tactical nuclear weapons. That being said, nobody can guarantee that he would never consider it. I was actually on WGBH the other night, and the moderator asked the question, well, isn't he going to use chemical weapons? And the answer was, well, the tactical nukes would be less damaging to the people on the ground than the use of chemical or biological weapons. So that I think it's really, it's a toss-up at this point. I don't think we're there yet. And I think that the Biden administration has been very carefully signaling by not giving all the weapons that the Ukrainians would like to have, that we don't want to engage directly with the Russians, and that we're trying to pull it back a little bit to where it's a more manageable fight between Ukraine and Russia and between Russia and the West.
At the same time, one of the things that's been impressive about the Biden administration's reaction is that they're not playing the escalation game, right? So Putin threatens, if you give HIMARS or if you give Patriot missiles, really bad things are going to happen. And the Biden administration has been very cool in responding and not escalating and not trying to respond.
It's unclear to me how much more Putin can actually escalate this. And just as Carol said, the tactical nuclear weapons would not guarantee a victory for Putin in this war if he seeks a victory, right? Because also we don't know actually what the end game here is for Putin. And so I don't think that the threat of nuclear some kind of strike is realistic, because also Putin would give up the only trump card left to him, right? Because the whole kind of idea of having nuclear weapons is about not using them. As soon as you use them, you lose every credibility, and then everything is on the table, right? So I think that potentially also Russia would expose itself to maybe some kind of counter strikes from I don't know obviously, but potentially taking out certain facilities by the Western allies of Ukraine. So we don't know.
Well, the conventional wisdom, if I can just jump in, the conventional wisdom is that the West would retaliate against a nuclear strike, but conventionally, and not itself use nuclear weapons. So some kind of fundamental attack against Russian infrastructure or something like that.
So, but that really begs the question, like, how much of this war is a Putin problem and how much of it is a Russia problem? Let's say that something does happen to Putin. He's not looking great. He's not that young for a Russian man. What do you think, Carol? I mean, is this entire war dependent on Putin remaining where he is, or would Russia continue this kind of aggression even under someone else? I'm giving you the easy questions.
Very easy, right?
Yeah.
I used to assign my students, this was a series of articles a couple of years ago about, is it Putin or is it Russia? Mm-hmm. And it's a really tough answer. I think that it would depend on how Putin left the scene if he were to leave the scene. I think it would depend on who would succeed him under those circumstances. I mean, if we're holding our breath for some more pacifistic, liberal leader, that's not going to happen. My biggest fear is that if Putin leaves the scene, somebody like Patrushev or somebody else who is equally as aggressive, if not more so than Putin, would become the president of the Russian Federation, in which case the war would be prolonged, if not waged, in an even more aggressive way. I think that there is something in the Russian psyche about Ukraine is ours, or the whole post-Soviet space. It was part of the Tsarist Empire too. I think that that's there. Where I see Putin a little bit differently, and it goes back to your democracy question, is that I think that Putin is terrified of anything that smacks of democracy. If you think about Maidan 2014, which is what we really have to go back to, that was people taking to the streets to remove a corrupt autocratic leader. And if you think back even further, there was 2011, 2012 in Russia, where there were demonstrations against the rigged Duma elections and everything. So I think that you have to think about the Putin piece maybe being the anti-democracy piece, the more imperialist piece of it, or wanting to regain a sphere of influence over the post-Soviet space. I would say that's more Russian. I mean, I was trying to tease the two out. And Ola, I don't know what you think, but that's sort of my take on what's going on. The idea that somehow Ukraine was going to be different from Russia because of the EU association agreement, because it was turning towards the West, that was something that more people than just Putin couldn't tolerate.
Yes, I think I agree on that with you. I think that for a lot of, there are many ways of approaching this, right? And there are many ways of trying to dissect kind of the Russian psyche or the Putin psyche. But what we see in interactions is that the Russian society has not done their homework or kind of some soul searching about the essence, what it means to be Russian. And unfortunately, to this day, what it often means is some kind of an imperialist notion of this great Russia, right? A kind of a Russia that is the largest country on the planet, that has this greatest country in the culture in the world, the greatest, or at least second greatest military power, and so on, right? And all of those things, one by one, kind of slowly fall apart and turn out not to be what they believe they are. And so unlike in other countries or in other societies where there is a kind of public discussion possible about these things and exactly the kind of soul searching that then leads the population perhaps to another image of themselves and of their society, we don't see that happening in Russia. And so I do believe that it's a more Russia war than Putin war. And no matter who realistically comes to power after Putin, the war probably will continue, maybe with a different intensity, maybe with a different outcome. Maybe it will be lost even by that. But the fact that they will want to continue the war, I have no doubt about that. The only caveat to that I see is that Putin has built basically a pyramid of power that, as we see that also in the military, the way how the military is organized, it all leads really to kind of this one individual who decides everything. And that creates a lot of inefficiencies within the system. And so as a result, just as was the case in the Soviet Union, the system is prone to collapse. And so it is possible that Russia may just collapse on itself. And with all of those private armies that have been created in recent years, right? As we know, the Wagner military group is not the only private army. There is at least 10, 15 big ones And some people speak of 100 or so. Kind of pretty much any kind of medium-sized oligarch has his own private army. So that already speaks that there is a lot of competition for power going on within the political elite or the power elite, economic elite of Russia, in the case that maybe Russia will collapse on itself, and then they would kind of grab their piece of the territory and try to control it as their little fiefdom. So that is, of course, I think, a very far-fetched scenario at this point, and this kind of collapse of the empire, of the Russian Empire, can still go on for a very long time and cost a lot of human lives. But kind of the current political climate in the country really does not put anyone on the horizon who is more Western-oriented or democratically oriented. And as we know, even the opposition, the Russian opposition, in fact, greeted the annexation of the Crimea, right, and kind of supported a lot of this quote-unquote acquisitions or gathering of the Russian lands.
Can I add another piece of the puzzle? I think one of Russia's concerns and Putin's concerns has been status, that they felt very much dissed by the international system when the Soviet Union collapsed. What I see now, and what I think is really interesting, is that by relying on China, in a sense, the Russians are selling their souls. I'm putting it much too strongly, to the Chinese, and there's beginning to be, at least among the more democratic forces who are in exile, questioning, well, are we going to be reliant on China? Are we going to be the resource backwoods to a Chinese empire? What are we giving them that they're supporting us? And I think that it's just a very short-sighted policy, like, oh, this is going to bolster our status, whereas ultimately I think Russia is going to be even more diminished, which could lead to all kinds of fundamental, political upheavals down the road by this reliance on China.
That's right.
So that's raised a question in the chat, which is, if Russia is weakened from the inside, if the political system, a pyramid looks stable, but it's also highly dependent on the person at the top and can be toppled pretty easily. Is it worth imposing additional sanctions that can increase somehow the economic pressure on Russia? Is that enough to end the war or to make Russia reconsider what it's doing in Ukraine? Oleg, should I start with you?
I don't think it's enough. Unfortunately, I think that Russia has to experience defeat, and the only way right now to achieve that is militarily. Putin as an individual is someone who only understands the language of power, of strength, and so I don't see how sanctions alone can undermine that regime. Also because it's a highly autocratic regime that can pull on various resources without responsibility, without kind of experiencing responsibility from the citizens, right? It's not a democracy. He cannot be voted out of power. And so he can basically deprive pensioners of their pensions and take away teachers' salary and so on, kind of break that social contract that he established back in 2000 when he first came to power, where basically he gave people economic dividends, right, in terms of salaries or secure jobs, etc., in return for them not interfering in politics, right, for basically just letting them do their own stuff. So he can take that slowly back, and he has been taking that back already, in order to mobilize resources. As we know, even though the West or European Union and other countries have slowly stopped buying Russian oil and gas, Russia still makes a tremendous amount of petrodollars, right? Russia has been stealing Ukrainian grain and selling it all over the world to Syria and other regimes, including to China, in fact, and making a lot of money on that and on a lot of other resources that the country has. So it can really go on for a very long time. Of course, tightening the grip of sanctions and isolating Russia would help in general, right? Because it would deprive them of kind of immediate resources for the war. It would make it more painful for them to, continue investing in the war. But it would not stop immediately the war itself.
Right. I agree. I think you could ask the question in terms of sort of short term, medium term, and long term. Short term, the sanctions are working, but they take a long time to work. I think if we and our West European allies actually tighten the sanctions and begin to crack down, as we're suddenly talking about, on the countries like Kazakhstan and others, Turkey, I don't know what we do about Turkey, that are just allowing sanctions goods to flow, then we could begin to see it. We could begin to make it more difficult for the Russians to continue the war effort. This whole idea that suddenly the population is going to rise up I don't see it at all. I think the Russians are long suffering, and all the public opinion polling, such as it is, seems to indicate that the average Russian citizen still supports the war and has bought into this line of, we're fighting an existential battle and we're protecting you and we're protecting the Russian people and the Great Russia idea. But very long term, Russia's going to emerge very much weakened from this war. Even if it's victorious somehow, I think Russia is going to have a long period of recouping and rebuilding and everything else, because people are saying that the economy has been pushed back 30 years, that westernization or modernization that we had begun to see in the early 2000s is gone. And I think other countries are going to be loath to trade and to deal with Russia, with the exception of oil and arms. And so we have to really just figure out what we're talking about and how long this process goes on.
Well,
yes,
but both of you are describing, a likelihood of this war dragging on for quite a long time. And I wanted to ask you, how do you think this war ends? How do we get to the point where there's no more fighting and that one of the sides or both of the sides have accomplished what they need to be able to stop fighting? Ole, let me start with you.
I think it's a very difficult question, because once again, we don't really know what the end game for Putin is. From everything that we have seen, there has been concerted effort to really just exterminate Ukrainian identity. So is it a genocide against Ukrainians that he seeks, to kind of just wipe us out from the face of the earth, or what is it really? We don't know. And so it's really hard to kind of speak about achieving certain goals for Russia, because the goals have been shifting for them on the one hand, and on the other hand, they have such a tight grip on the media inside Russia that they can sell anything as a victory, even a retreat, right? As we know. And so I think it's very difficult to kind of to try and establish that for Russia. For Ukraine, I think it's easier because it has been a generational struggle for Ukrainians. Ever since the 17th century, people in Ukraine have been struggling for independence and for a sense of autonomy and sovereignty from Russia. And there are, there are whole history books written about that struggle and how many million people died fighting for that, or how many million people were starved to death fighting, for that, and so on. So it has reached a point that Ukrainians are not willing to give up no matter the cost. And so I think the only way to stop is if the West is really interested in kind of Ukraine's victory and reestablishing the world order that is based on rules, on agreements, on trust, then Ukraine has to win. And for that, the West has to help with weapons that will not just assure that Ukraine doesn't lose today or tomorrow or in a week or two, but that Ukraine wins. And that includes all kinds of conventional weapons that Ukraine thinks, would help Ukraine winning, including the fighter jets, including long-range missiles, and so on. Something that would help Ukraine disrupt the delivery lines, resupply, and so on, and then take back the territory. Ukraine only wants, the internationally established borders of the country as recognized by Russia, among other international partners, in 1991. So that's all. So that means Russia has to withdraw from the occupied areas of Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, from the currently occupied southern Ukraine, so that's Zaporizhia, parts of Kherson Oblast, and from the Crimea. If that happens for Ukrainians, that will be that's basically the end of the war.
What do you think, Carol? I mean, would Ukraine consider bombing Russia, attacking Russia? That's been one of the arguments against providing F-16s or longer range missiles. Do you think that that's something that is possible?
Well, I think it's already happening, but only along the border. But we do know that there were those 2 drone attacks on the airfields outside of Moscow. We don't know what happened in Bryansk the other day, where 2 planes and 2 helicopters were down. Nobody's saying very much about that. The Ukrainians have also been attacking in Crimea, blowing up fuel depots and everything else, all in preparation for the spring, summer offensive, whatever it's going to be. So I think that they already have. Now, they're not. I mean, I have my own suspicions about the drone attack on the Kremlin 2 weeks ago, but they haven't done anything that was that outlandish or, an egregious open attack on Russia per se. But I had a different a take on your question. If you want to ask what conditions might lead both sides to agree at least to a ceasefire, some kind of line of demarcation, one possibility would be if the coming Ukrainian offensive were successful enough to get to at least to the 2014 lines. Would that be enough to begin some kind of at least ceasefire negotiations? I'm not talking about a peace process, but ceasefire negotiation. But I certainly understand Ukraine's suspicions about Russia's intentions, because after all, the war really started in 2014. And every time it looked like there might be a ceasefire, the Russians violated it and continued the war effort. What would bring Putin to the table? I don't know. I don't really have an answer. And I think Ola is right to question what Russian motives are. Neither side at the moment, even rhetorically, is preparing its people for any kind of compromise. Mm-hmm. And that I find worrying if you're talking about even getting to a ceasefire. I mean, Zelensky, and I understand the patriotism, so don't take this the wrong way, but Zelensky is talking about liberating every inch of Ukrainian territory. There's no talk about a compromise. Would Putin pull back and accept the 2014 lines as some kind of victory and spin it as a victory and then say, okay, we've done what we set out to do and go home? We can't guarantee that either. Should there be international monitors along some kind of line of demarcation? Maybe that would help. And I'm not talking about the OSCE. I'm really talking about armed, more like UN forces and things like that. I don't know, but right now, I don't see any avenues even to get to the point where discussions could begin, because neither side is willing to entertain ending the war under any kind of circumstances.
Yes, and kind of, I think it's important to kind of from the Ukrainian perspective to understand what compromise would actually entail, right? And so we see that in the Crimea, people are being put in jails, being tortured, executed, and so on. The same is happening in other occupied territories. So the compromise means to basically prolong the suffering of the people on the occupied territories. And so that's why it's so hard to make the compromise. If it was just about the territory, about the land, the piece of land, Russia is already the biggest country in the world. If it needs more land, sure, take it, we don't care. But the reality is that people have realized that this war is not about the land. It's about the identity. It's about Ukrainians who are not willing to submit. We're not willing to live by the rules of Russia, of Putin. And that is the problem. And it's not going to go away if Putin keeps Crimea and part of the Donbass.
Well, and I think even in Crimea, there's kind of a buyer's remorse that, yes, they voted supposedly for annexation and to join Russia. And I think there's a lot of unhappiness now with the way the Russian occupation, not even during the war in the last year, but prior to the war has gone on since 2014.
And Carol, what are you seeing in terms of kind of the circles that you're in at MIT? Among your colleagues, like, what are people doing to stay involved and to stay connected with what's going on?
Well, people, certainly in the MIT community, people are very concerned about Russia. I co-chair a seminar series that's been dedicated this whole year and a half to what's been happening in Ukraine and the war and everything. There's a Ukrainian program. I was asked to speak last fall at an MIT alumni event where they were raising money for Ukraine and everything. And if I may, I'm also on the board of a Jewish organization that is very involved on the ground, was before the war and continues to be, both helping refugees when they've left Ukraine, helping them come back if they want to come back, and continuing to serve the elderly, providing medication and food and everything. And trying to maintain as normal a life as possible, like for the little kids and the teenagers and everything. There are all kinds of activities, frequently by candlelight in the basement of buildings around the country and everything else, but really trying to help and give them a sense of normalcy. And also, as Ola described, trying to find people jobs, people who've lost their jobs and their livelihoods. And during the winter, we were trying to provide heating assistance, such as it was, and generators and things like that. And it's the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and the link was just put up in the chat. So please, if you're considering, to help the Jewish communities around Ukraine, both in Dnipropetrovsk, which is Boston's sister city, but also in Kiev and Odessa and Kharkiv and other places, please contribute as well. And just to keep the good fight going, in a sense, and keep, as Ola said, keep people aware of what's been happening there and the tragic humanitarian consequences of the war.
Yeah, and I think one of the things we didn't touch on, but we also have to remember, is that the war has not only affected people still in Ukraine, but it has really triggered an incredible wave of migrants and refugees to Europe and to other countries, particularly Poland and Germany. These are about 85% women and children who are now struggling to make new lives in these countries, even as they really want to go home back to their husbands or their grandmothers or their houses. But the response of the European countries has been quite remarkable, and hopefully will continue, because this crisis will last in Europe as long as it will last in Ukraine.
Right. And it shows also that when we are faced with such challenges, that we are capable of showing the best of us as human beings. And I think that really if we look at this war, not just in some kind of cool and very theoretical way, but in a way that touches us as human beings, I think that we can be very effective in trying to stop it, including stopping Putin, right? The big question of today's conversation: can he be stopped? I think if all of us cared more and invited other people to care, then absolutely he can be stopped.
Right. Thank you, Ole. I think that is a good place for us to stop as well. I want to thank the JCC and WGBH for putting this conversation up and for making it available to a wide audience. And let me turn it back over to you, Lily.
Thank you, Alexandra. And thank you so much to Carol and to Ole for such an amazing and interesting conversation. I learned so much in the past hour, and I really heard how complex this all is politically and how simple it is from a humanitarian lens, in terms of the real mandate for all of us to sort of use our compassion and our privilege and our voices to meet the needs of millions of people who are really suffering. So thank you so much for bringing this to the JCC and to WGBH. And please come back again for next year's Hot Buttons Cool Conversations series. It's really a pleasure to have all of you. So thank you again.